So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are located. Welcome to today's webinar, EMV 3D Secure Data Elements. Hi, my name is Randy Vanderhoof. I'm the Executive Director of the U.S. Payments Forum and also Director of the the Secure Technology Alliance. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available for playback along with the presentation deck after the webinar has been concluded today. There'll be time at the end for questions, so we encourage listeners to submit their questions using the user dashboard on your screen. I'll return at the end of the presentation to lead the Q&A session and I suggest that you submit questions while the speakers are presenting so that we have time to organize them in advance so we can get to as many of them as possible with the time that we have left. If we can move to the next slide, please. So for those of you who are not familiar with the U.S. Payments Forum, here's a brief overview of who we are. The forum is a cross-industry body focused on supporting the introduction and implementation of EMV and other new and emerging technologies that protect the security of and enhance the opportunities for payment transactions within the U.S. We cover not only the what, where, and when of payments, but more importantly, we talk a lot about the how payments innovation is happening in the U.S. Current projects that we're focused on with regard to EMV are those late maturing markets like the petro and transit and hospitality merchants who are still working through their EMV enablement issues. Also, EMV contactless and mobile acceptance testing and certification is still a hot topic in our market. And issuer considerations for the issuance of contactless EMV, known as dual interface, is another topic that we're taking very seriously. Beyond the EMV, we have a number of advanced payments topics and issues that we're focused on, including the further expansion and understanding of the multiple payments and tokenization solutions that are being implemented in the market, how authentication related to biometrics and the future of various forms of cardholder verification method or CVM, as well as changes that are being made to signature requirements and how that's impacting on the market. We've spent a lot of time in education around these new emerging technologies, such as today's topic on 3D Secure, also the coming of the Secure Remote Commerce platform, and other card-not-present fraud tools that are important for all issuers and merchants to be working on as we continue to fight the battle to improve transaction efficiency and security at the same time. If we can move to the next slide, please. So the U.S. Payments Forum brings together in an open forum of equals across the payments ecosystem, leading companies representing the global payments brands, financial payments issuers, merchants, processors, debit networks, mobile services providers, and other industry suppliers, integrators, associations, government agencies, and transit operators make up the U.S. Payments Forum. And the work that we do is done through collaboration projects to develop resources to assist in the U.S. migration of EMV and implementation of other new and emerging technologies. And those collaboration projects result in white papers and webinars, workshops, conference presentations, and numerous ways in which we communicate that information to the general public. We also have been working on best practices and commenting on technical recommendations from standards bodies. Our education programs are centered around our members as well as the outside industry. And as I mentioned, webinars, workshops, and forum member meeting tutorials and published resources are common for how we communicate that information. We also publish our monthly newsletter as well as weekly communications on industry news and best practices that are coming out. And as a multi-stakeholder organization with a wide distribution of member types, networking and forming relationships amongst all of the stakeholders has proven to be an extremely valuable part of the U.S. Payments Forum experience. If anyone is interested in further information about the U.S. Payments Forum, we suggest you check out the U.S. Payments Forum website, which is at uspaymentsforum.org. If we go to the next slide, please. So now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Before we get started into the depth of today's topic on 3DS, we have Christy Cook, who is the Director of Payments Acceptance Technology at Target and the current chair of the U.S. Payments Forum Steering Committee. She's going to share some information about an upcoming U.S. Payments Forum project on new EMV 3D secure data elements. Christy will then turn things over to Michael Horn, a Senior Product Manager in the Global Network Operations team at American Express, where he focuses on fraud solutions in areas of remote commerce. Additionally, he represents American Express in several industry groups, including the U.S. Payments Forum, the W3C, and an EMVCO as a member of the 3D Secure Working Group. And following Michael, we have Ian Poole, Senior Director of Global Product at Cardinal Commerce, with an overall responsibility for driving and executing Cardinal Commerce's product strategy for the digital authentication platform for merchants, e-commerce platforms, and payment service providers. Next slide, please. So here's Christy Cook, who's going to brief you on this important new U.S. Payments Forum project. Christy?
Thanks, Randy. So as Randy mentioned, we wanted to take a minute to share about a project which will leverage the information learned on this call. One of the unique aspects of EMV 3D Secure Authentication is that it takes place between a merchant and issuer using far more data than has been shared in the past. The hope is that this data sharing can reduce gross fraud, increase approval rates, and do so with less friction in the checkout. To support these outcomes, the U.S. Payments Forum is holding a collaboration session between merchants and issuers at our upcoming March meeting in Phoenix. This open discussion will focus on sharing past learnings from these data elements and addressing stakeholder questions. As you can see, we are planning prep calls for the issuer and merchant segments in advance of the in-person session, and we'd love your participation. If you're a merchant or issuer who is not a current U.S. Payments Forum member, we're happy to extend the guest invitation for you. Please email Kathy Medich to indicate your interest in the project. The merchant prep calls will also be led by the Merchant Advisory Group, so if you choose to participate, you may receive information directly from Laura Townsend at the MAG. Next, I'll turn it over to Mike to provide an overview on the new EMV 3DS. Next slide.
All right, thank you, Christy. Next slide. So let me start off by giving just a very brief background of 3DS. 3D Secure has been around for quite some time, actually since 2001, so long before smart devices existed. So when 3DS was first designed, it was intended to secure payment transactions on PC-based browsers. So fast forward to today, and you'll see a completely revamped, redesigned 3DS, officially known as EMV 3D Secure. EMV 3D Secure is managed by EMVCO, developed by EMVCO's members and associates to ensure global interoperability and that data authentication needs are sufficiently met. While the core principles of verifying cardholders still remain the same, there's more to highlight here. So number one, more and more transactions are occurring online and on many different devices. So 3DS needed to expand to those devices. Issuers' risk decisioning capabilities have become more robust and intelligent. So 3DS needed to supply useful, meaningful data to help them detect fraud more efficiently and accurately. And you'll notice that this extra data is going to be the theme of this presentation. Also, balance between merchants and issuer was needed. So EMV 3DS gives merchants the mechanism to communicate their authentication preferences and also gives merchants a choice to proceed or to not proceed with cardholder challenges. So during this overview, I'll review the new enhancements that EMV 3DS brings, as well as key benefits to stakeholders in the 3DS ecosystem. And I'll walk us through a couple authentication flow examples before Ian gives a deep dive on EMV 3DS data elements. Next slide. So this slide provides simply a conceptual illustration of how 3DS works and where it's positioned in the payment process. But I think most importantly, this demonstrates that with cooperation between the merchant and issuer, the shared goal of having the transaction approved is more likely to be achieved. So again, this is all conceptual, but the left side represents the 3DS authentication process. And the idea here is that as part of the checkout process, the merchant would provide information about the cardholder, the transaction, and several other data categories to help the issuer verify the cardholder's identity. So if the cardholder is successfully authenticated, the issuer will provide proof of authentication or a cryptogram that the merchant can include in the authorization. So this proof of authentication strengthens the issuer's confidence in the transaction, resulting in an increased likelihood of an authorization approval. So the reverse here could also be very helpful. So for example, if authentication were to fail, it could be due to a number of reasons, like for example, a one-time passcode was entered incorrectly, or someone attempting to make a purchase with a stolen card. Merchants can get that authentication result and make informed decisions and opt not to proceed to authorization, knowing the transaction is questionable. Okay, next slide. So what features and enhancements does EMV 3DS bring? So the first feature here, the emphasis is on data. So there's a lot for this. Merchants can provide issuers with significantly more data than its predecessor. The data set can include information that goes above and beyond typical transaction data. So device information, merchant data, consumer data, they're all examples that can be provided when the authentication process is initiated. This allows for better, more accurate decisions to be made by issuers, often without the need to interact with the cardholder. And this is key. So when cardholder interaction isn't required, the merchant's checkout experience is preserved while taking advantage of the extra layer of security that EMV 3DS provides. Also, EMV 3DS was developed with prices in mind. So today purchases can be made on the obvious, like mobile phones and tablets, but also on mediums like TVs, through gaming consoles, set-top boxes, wearables, and even refrigerators. Apps on these devices can be integrated with an approved 3DS SDK to ensure consistency in terms of functionality, security, and user experience. Additionally, merchants have the ability to initiate an EMV 3DS transaction without the cardholder present. So for example, in a recurring billing scenario, a merchant would be able to request authentication on the second, third, fourth, and so on payments to ensure the account is in good standing and to obtain proof of authentication that could be applied for those specific payments. Another feature that was added was the ability to perform non-payment authentication. And this can be used for activities like provisioning a card or token on file or within a digital wallet. And in addition to supporting a wide range of authentication methods, EMV 3DS introduces 2 new authentication methods to give merchants and issuers further flexibility in defining what the checkout and authentication experience will look like. Those new methods are out-of-band authentication and decoupled authentication. So an example of out-of-band authentication, use of this might be appropriate for a consumer making a purchase on a television. So rather than having a consumer enter credentials on the TV interface, authentication might actually occur on the consumer smartphone via push notification or by logging in to his or her bank app using biometrics. Decoupled authentication can be extremely useful in many different payment scenarios as it separates the authentication from the merchant's checkout experience. So this can be used in place of the traditional step-up or as the mechanism to accommodate cardholder challenges for merchant-initiated transactions. So before I move on to the next slide, I do want to emphasize that while I only have these 4 enhancements highlighted, EMV 3DS does contain a number of additional improvements not mentioned here. Next slide. Okay, so the EMV 3DS enhancements that I highlighted on the previous slide, they all contribute to the benefits that each stakeholder in the 3DS ecosystem receives. So for merchants, they're able to integrate 3DS into their app or browser-based checkout process and can expect a consistent look and feel even across issuers. Checkout abandonment is minimized during authentication. And again, this is really a function of 2 things. So more data to promote frictionless authentication, but also visual consistency and simplicity when cardholder challenges are required. This also allows merchants to initiate authentication and extends 3DS to scenarios that the old 3DS couldn't accommodate. And these next bullet points, while I have these 2 listed under merchant benefits, I really think that along with most of these other points presented here, they're all really shared benefits, but 3DS can help reduce the potential for fraud-related chargebacks and more authorizations are approved. So in this case, everyone wins. Moving on to the issuer benefit. So issuers are able to verify the cardholder is who he or she says they are, and also reduce the risk of fraud. Issuers can feed a considerable amount of meaningful data into their risk engines and only interact with cardholders when fraud might be suspected. New devices and channels are supported and can be considered by issuers to present the most appropriate form of authentication. And the flexibility to support many different authentication methods still remains. And also, lastly, the cardholders are encouraged to transact how they want to. And finally, for consumers, most authentications will be invisible to consumers. So, again, when they're not bothered, that's a good thing most of the time. Online security is also enhanced, so consumers are protected, so fraud can be detected and stopped before it happens. And consumers also benefit from an improved and consistent user experience. So the more consumers become familiar with and aware of a similar authentication process, this contributes to lower cart abandonment during authentication. Okay, next slide. Now on to the flows. So this flow demonstrates a frictionless authentication example. So this is really the flow that I think everyone wants to try to achieve because it's really simple. So in step 1, the cardholder checks out at the merchant site. Then the merchant provides its 3DS server, formerly known as the merchant plugin or MPI in 3DS 1.0, with data to be included in the authentication request message in step 2. Then the directory server will receive that authentication request, route it to the appropriate issuer, where its access control server or ACS will consume that data and assess the risk on the transaction. If the ACS has a high level of confidence that the transaction is legitimate, the authentication response indicating that the transaction was successfully authenticated will be sent in step 3. The proof of authentication, or in other words, the cryptogram, as I mentioned earlier, will be included in the authentication response for inclusion in the authorization message. And to close out the transaction, the merchant provides the cardholder with the purchase confirmation in step 4. So the key takeaways from this example is that this is the ideal flow. it secures the transaction while preserving that checkout experience that the merchant intended to have. And two, and probably the most important, that this is that abundant, meaningful, and accurate data can help issuers determine the legitimacy of the transaction without the need for cardholder interaction more times than not. Next slide. But in the case that a cardholder challenge is necessary, this is what the flow looks like at a high level. Cardholder challenges shouldn't be something that happens often, but if they do, there's usually a good reason for it. So for example, it might be determined that the transaction carries higher risk, and that could be due to an unusually high purchase amount, shipping to an unknown address, or using a device that's not recognized by the issuer. So these all could be indicators of fraud. So in order to establish confidence in the transaction, a cardholder may be asked to authenticate. And this can be done using any authentication method that's determined to be appropriate. So examples include one-time passcodes, push notifications, or bank app logins. So onto the flow. So like the frictionless example shown on the previous slide, the cardholder will check out in step 1, and the merchant's 3DS server again will include as much meaningful data as possible and will send on an authentication request in step 2. This time, however, in step 3, the issuer determines that a cardholder challenge is necessary. So in step 4, through its 3DS server, the merchant will send a challenge request message, basically telling the issuer to proceed with the cardholder challenge. If you recall back to the first slide, I mentioned that, EMV 3DS provides merchants with some balance here, as opposed to the older version of 3DS. So at this point in the flow, a merchant does have the decision whether or not they want to proceed or not proceed with the cardholder challenge. But for this example, we assume that the challenge was carried forward. We'll assume that the cardholder was successfully authenticated, which will then trigger step 5, where the results of the authentication and proof of authentication will be provided to the merchant's 3DS server. And finally, to close out the transaction, the merchant provides the cardholder with purchase confirmation. So an important thing to note here is that data provided by merchants is still considered valuable to issuers despite the need for a cardholder challenge in this case. So if the cardholder successfully authenticates, issuers can associate the data received from this transaction with the cardholder so that future transactions can be more easily identified as legitimate and possibly authenticated without friction. Okay, so this ends the EMV 3DS overview portion of the presentation. For those new to 3DS, I hope you found this to be informative. And for those already familiar with 3DS, hopefully I got the point across that data does play a big role in this version of 3DS. And just to be sure that we further emphasize the importance of data, I'll pass over control to Ian to tell you more.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, United States Payments Forum, as well as all the attendees today. I appreciate you allowing me to present. And as Mike mentioned, I hope you'll be able to take something from this and further your knowledge of EMV 3DS. So in my portion of today, we're going to go through really the EMV 3DS data elements in more detail that can be shared both between the merchant and the issuing bank environments using the EMV 3DS rails, also known as 3DS 2.0. Next slide. So if you look at all the benefits of EMV 3DS that Mike went through, a lot of those benefits are driven off the amount and the consistency of the data that's exchanged both between the merchant and the issuing bank systems. So by providing more consistent data between both the merchant and the issuer, issuers will be able to leverage a lot of the latest tools out there in regards to risk-based authentication to make the best decision for that given transaction, with the goal of maximizing the number of authenticated transactions, increasing approvals, minimizing the fraud loss, all while giving the best user experience. In addition, by leveraging the EMV 3DS protocol, it allows for global interoperability. So by leveraging this in the US, it'll give you access to other countries or regions of the world where you may do business in. So it's not only important for merchants to be able to provide the information that we'll talk about today, but also from an issuer perspective to incorporate this in their overall risk-based strategy, ultimately to make the most use and the best use of this data that can be leveraged through the updated in this protocol. Next slide, please. So as some of you may know, really the big difference between 3DS 1.0 and EMV 3DS or 3DS 2.0 is the ability to pass 10 times more data from the merchant's environment to the issuing environment. And really that's kind of the meat and the heart of today's presentation. I'm going to get into a lot of the specifics on really what this enhanced data is, what are required, what's conditionally required, what are optional to be able to be passed. Next slide, please. So a way to kind of visualize this and thinking in my head was, how do we create some tangible buckets of data to help drive and move the conversation? So we thought of it as 4 kind of distinct buckets. So you have transactional and consumer data. We have authentication data, as well as merchant data, and then device data. And these are different parts of the transaction that a merchant can include as part of this overall transaction flow. Next slide. So here's a little bit more about these buckets. So if you think of from a transaction and a checkout page perspective, you have the customer, they added their items to their bag, they're entering their payment credentials, and they hit submit. So really we're talking about here is details about that consumer, maybe their billing, shipping, as well as some other information about the order that they're making a purchase on. And a lot of those data elements are required or conditionally required, which I'll get into. The next bucket is authentication data. And this is outside of the transaction. This is how the user or how the consumer interacts with the merchant site. So did they log in to a card on file, to an account on file where they have payment cards, or was it a guest checkout? In addition, you'll be able to link prior authentication history and transactions to a given transaction as well. The third bucket is merchant data, which is really like merchant risk information. So what other attributes does the merchant have on this particular order, this particular customer, that may help the issuer in making a risk-based decision, as well as cardholder account information. So let's say there is an account on file and there's some activity on that account or an account creation date. Those are some other attributes a merchant can pass. So it's not only that given transaction, but how that cardholder, how that consumer is interacting with the merchant's environment are additional data elements that can be collected and passed through the enhancements in EMV 3DS. And then lastly is device data. So we'll get into some specifics on whether it's a browser-based transaction or a native app-based transaction, and what are the different requirements for browser-based transactions versus an iOS app versus an Android application. Next. So the first bucket we'll go into more detailed are the transactional and checkout page information. So most of this information is either required or conditionally required, which basically means it's required unless it's not available. So if you look at cardholder information, the account number, which is the credit or debit card, the expiration date of that card, the billing address, city, postal code, state can all be passed. then the email, mobile phone, cardholder name are all can be passed in the message. And then from a shipping perspective, this tends to be conditionally required. So if it's a physical good, you'll have a shipping address, which means it's required to be passed. And then if it's a digital good, you most likely don't have a shipping address, so that wouldn't be required from that perspective. The next category in this is merchant information. So there's some basic information that needs to be passed to the issuer, just to let the issuer know who's making this request. So they'll be able to get the merchant name, the merchant URL, the country it's being initiated from, the merchant category code, the acquiring BIN and the acquiring MID, as well as some new identifiers to not only identify the merchant, but maybe what provider they're also using. So those will all be incremental data passed in the message. The third subcategory is transaction information. So that's the amount of what's being purchased, the currency, and a transaction type indicating what type of transaction this may be. And another sub element is the device information. So depending on the device, and I have a slide in more detail on this, but if it's a browser-based device, it has specific requirements around the browser header, the IP address, JavaScript's enabled, language, other depth, height, and width of the device and the screen, time zone, user agent. And then from a native app perspective, this depends on whether it's an iOS or Android, as well as there's some common elements that I'll discuss in more detail in a little bit. Next slide. The second bucket is authentication data. So this is more information on how this consumer interacts with the merchant site. So if the merchant has an account a user can create, they not only support an account, but a card on file, there's incremental authentication data that can be collected prior to even making a purchase. So if the consumer opted for a guest checkout and not want to sign in, or if they're using a merchant system credentials, or there's placeholders for if merchants using some of the latest FIDO authentication standards can be passed through. And then the date of this authentication on the site, as well as there's a placeholder for some authentication data or some signature that can be passed to kind of prove that. And then from an issuing perspective, if you receive this information, it's just a helpful indicator to say, is this merchant always requiring this customer to log in? Do they also support guest checkout? And possibly can have different risk criteria based on this information as well. Next slide. Within the authentication data, there's a concept of prior authentication. So this is specifically related to EMV 3DS. So if the merchant is running EMV 3DS and they authenticated the customer last week or last month, they'll be able to record whether it was a frictionless transaction or if it went through a cardholder challenge by the issuer. There's a date of that as well as an authentication data. So the ability to pass a reference identifier to that transaction, basically linking it together to say, hey, they shop with us on the site. We typically go through EMV 3DS, and here is the last kind of prior authentication, ultimately trying to help provide enough data and information to the issuer to make the optimal decision. Next slide. The third bucket is around merchant data. So the merchant can also provide its own risk identifiers within the transaction, ultimately to provide more information to the issuer And if it's shared frequently, it can also help build and validate kind of a customer's buying decision. So some examples here are like shipping and delivery. So like a shipping method indicator can be provided saying that this is shipping to a billing address, either it's shipping to another verified address on file, it's shipping to a different address, or possibly ship to store. And I know that, you know, some online retailers support ship to store, and that may have a different risk profile than you know, shipping to the billing address using your standard shipping option. So from an issuing perspective, you could run either analytics in real time or analytics after the fact to see if this is coming through and if you notice any patterns for ship to store transactions versus shipping to a billing address. Another element is delivery email. So it most likely will be the same, but if it's different, it can be certainly passed. Delivery time frame. So is this electronic delivery? Is this a same day delivery, overnight, 2 or more day shipping? Also can be a possible indicator of fraud depending on the time frame of the delivery. There's some carve-outs for pre-order or reorder as well as gift card. So from like a pre-order perspective, if the merchandise is currently available or if it's for a future availability, like a pre-order of a game or a new device, as well as the first time order or reorder of a product. So if this is a consistent purchase pattern or behavior of a particular consumer, maybe they always, you know, buy paper towels once a month, you know, merchant can be able to set this in the transaction to ultimately give this type of information to the issuer. And lastly, gift cards. So there's specific information on gift cards. So whether it's the amount, the currency, and count. This is a valuable information for an issuer because gift cards could tend to be higher risk than other products. So if a gift card is sent in with either other items or is bought on its own, it's good to kind of call that out itself to ultimately inform the issuer. Or let's say a merchant has a particular channel where maybe they don't do gift cards today, or they do enable gift cards. This could be a channel where maybe they just provide this type of information for those particular transactions. So ultimately, you know, or if there's merchants that don't accept consumers to buy gift cards online, this could be a net new opportunity for merchants to run this through authentication and let the issuer know these are our gift cards, and it could be handled slightly differently. Next slide. In continuation with the merchant data bucket, there's some specific carve-outs for cardholder account information. So not only can we track and record and pass if the user went through guest checkout, if they logged in an account, but there also could be some information passed about the account and its current standing. So when was this account created? Is there any age of the indicator? So it was just created, it was created less than 30 days ago, or it's been an account with us for 3 years. In addition, there's some password information. So if this password was just changed, there's an indicator to say changed in the last day, last 30 days, as well as the date of the change. Shipping name indicator to inform whether the name that it's being shipped to is different than the cardholder's name. It could just be yes, it's the same, or no, it's not. And then a payment account indicator and age. So not only information about the account, but what's the underlying funding mechanism, the credit or debit card tied to it, and what's the current status or indicator of that. So if it's enrolled with the account or it's been tied to the account for some time, that particular indicator can be passed as well. Then there's some shipping usage. So the shipping address is frequently used with this customer and this account, as well as the date of the last time it was used or first used. There's some information around transaction count, so number of transactions within the last 48 hours, as well as transaction counts, for the last year, including the amount and account of those transactions. So more a high-level counter that could be passed, but ultimately, another indicator that could be passed. Lastly, there's fraud activity. So if there's any suspicious activity on the account, the merchant can pass yes or no. They could even, pass this information on the request and also request to step up or request to challenge. So there's additional features flags that merchants can take advantage of to request a challenge. And then lastly, account purchases and add a card attempts. So what were the account purchases for the last 6 months, as well as the last 24 hours? How many add card attempts, could have or did happen that could be passed? Next slide. The last bucket is around device data. So I mentioned it previously that based on the channel could have more device information or not. So if we're looking from a browser-based transaction, so desktop, tablet, phone, these are the browser information that is currently required to make a browser-based transaction. In addition, the protocol allows for issuers to run their own device data collection during browser-based transactions. And that's just a requirement of the browser-based. The next category is native app-based transactions. So we think of iOS and Android, and so you have what's called common elements. So regardless of the platform, there'll be these elements you can collect across platforms. So the platform name, the device model, the OS name, the OS version, locale, the advertising ID, screen resolution, device name, IP address, latitude and longitude are typically the required common elements, regardless of iOS or Android. And then when we get into iOS and Android specific, these are more conditionally required. If you're able to collect these or using an EMV 3DS SDK to collect these, then do so and pass them. And then from Android, they have over 100 fields that can be collected as well. Next slide. So in summary, we talked about the 4 main buckets: transactional checkout information, which for the most part are required or conditionally required. There's incremental data about the consumer and their interaction with the merchant site. So that's the authentication data and merchant data, and those are optional to be passed. And then lastly is device data, which there are requirements for minimum device data to be passed. And then there's conditional elements, like I mentioned, for iOS and Android. Some of those specific platform elements may be conditionally required to pass. Next slide. So in closing, ultimately what trying to convey with this slide is that a merchant may have very deep understanding of a particular customer and their journey from order frequency to their average order value, to their history, as well as their multiple cards they may have within a merchant account, and how the customer interacts with the site. So how they interact from page to page, if they have an account, if they log in, or they prefer guest checkout. There's quite a bit of information a merchant has. And then from an issuer perspective, it's very broad and deep. So it's not just that one merchant, but multiple merchants where they use the payment card, as well as cardholders' average spend, as well as the purchase channel they tend to make these. So if it's online, card present, native app, as well as the interaction with the issuing bank platform. So logging into my online bank account or using my online bank's native application. So how do we take the depth and breadth of both systems that we have and marry them together? And I think leveraging where we can all the enhancements and data elements within EMV 3DS could give us that opportunity to be able to consistently share this data to ultimately make the best decisions possible, which is increase approvals, reduce fraud by giving the best customer experience. And with that, I'd like to thank you and hand it off to Randy.
Great. Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Michael, for a terrific presentation. Before we move right into the Q&A session, I have a couple of quick announcements I'd like to add, and then we'll go into the Q&A. So if we can go to the next slide, please. As Christy mentioned at the top of the webinar, the U.S. Payments Forum is kicking off a major EMV 3DS data element project to help stakeholders who will be implementing 3DS understand how the implementation of the specifications by the U.S. market providers and adopters will be optimized. And we're always looking for more engagement from issuers and merchants to join this forum. There's also going to be an important in-person meeting coming up in a few weeks, the March U.S. Payments Forum member meeting, and 2019 Payments Summit will be held March 11th through the 14th in Phoenix, Arizona. Excuse me. If you're not a member of the U.S. Payments Forum, you would need to become a member to participate, unless you attend as a guest, and you can inquire about that by contacting Kathy Medich if you want to be part of this working committee. The Payment Summit Conference is open to all attendees, and so that session will be covering all things related to payments, including EMV, fintech, mobile wallets, NFC, contactless, open transit systems, and much more. And we would encourage you to go on the website for the Payment Summit and see all of the great speakers and agenda topics that are going to be covered during that session. So let's just move to the final contact slide, and we'll start with your questions. Okay, first question up will be for Michael Horn, and that question is, for transactions that have prior authorization, whose responsibility is it to store, retrieve, initiate the prior authentication code, and the merchant, issuer, provider, or acquirer?
So this is a good question. I think you might mean prior authentication. So this prior authentication code, or the ACS transaction ID, is basically a reference that ACSs could use to reference an authentication that happened before. And this is especially useful in merchant-initiated transactions where the cardholder isn't present and the merchant is looking for a frictionless authentication. So providing this prior authentication value can help that ACS look back to that original authentication and have confidence to authenticate without a cardholder interaction. So as far as storing it, I think there are a couple ways to go about it. The merchant can store the ACS transaction ID, and I believe the 3DS server could potentially store that on behalf of the merchant. The ACS transaction ID isn't considered sensitive, so I don't think there's any problems with storing that there. And perhaps, Ian, you might be able to give a perspective from the 3DS server side on the best way to handle that.
Yeah, so from a prior authentication, it could be handled two ways. One, from a merchant perspective, if they wanted to store that on their side, or possibly from their 3DS server vendor could help them with that.
Okay, thank you. This next question is for you, Ian. In the 3DS 2.0 world, issuers are expected to leverage risk-based authentication models, limiting their challenge rate to less than 5%. Will this metric be monitored by the card networks?
Yeah, so you have your core EMV and 3DS specification, and then on top of that, each payment network comes out with their own rules around it, as well as their own program around it. And some networks have thrown out some risk-based authentication limits, specifically around challenges. So yes, that would be a per network requirement, as well as per region. So depending on the region, may or may not have this requirement, depending if there's some type of regulation there as well. But speaking specifically to the US, yes, it would be payment network specific.
Okay. Next question, also to Michael. Can you clarify when the merchant makes a decision to allow the challenge flow? Is it based on per transaction circumstances or preset parameters?
Yeah, so one positive thing about EMV 3DS is that it does give merchants that visibility that they didn't have in the old version of 3DS. So merchants will now know how an issuer might want to authenticate the transaction. So obviously, if it's frictionless authentication, there's no issue there. But when a challenge is presented, the merchant can also take into consideration their own thoughts about the transaction's risk, right? So if they feel that there are certain parameters around in which to allow a challenge to proceed, certainly I think that's something that they could work with their 3DS server provider to set. So for example, if they want to proceed with challenges that are over a certain purchase amount, or perhaps have a specific shipping method attached to it, certainly they could work on setting those defaults.
Thank you. Ian, this one's for you. Much of this data that's collected and utilized today by merchants for their own fraud mitigation services, should merchants keep utilizing their internal logic or simply pass these data elements through via 3DS to the issuer, since the issuer determines when the transaction will be authorized anyway?
Yeah, I would say from an overall strategy, we'd still want to continue to do both. One being from a EMV 3DS perspective, we're trying to give as much information to the issuer to help ultimately, prove the identity of that consumer and who they say they are, or challenge that customer and force an authentication to occur. When you look at other fraud tools, they not only take some of the consumer information, but details about the particular order, so validating the items in the cart and some other information about the order being purchased. So really, we look at how do you best combine both of them. So taking the result of authentication and leveraging that as an input value in your current fraud tools, ultimately trying to maximize the order throughput. So if you have a successful authenticated transaction, you may handle that differently. If it failed authentication, you also might handle that differently. So I would say it's more the combination of both than just relying solely on one versus the other.
How would an issuer leverage future ship date if a merchant passes that in the transaction? What about split shipments? Is that included in the type of optional merchant data that could be shared? And how could issuers leverage that beyond the authorization decision?
Yeah, I can answer the question about split shipments. So, one example that we've talked about in various meetings has been using a phone and a tablet example. So let's say a phone and tablet are purchased at the same time, but the phone is back ordered. the tablet would get shipped first, assuming this purchase has gone through authentication, of course, but the tablet would be shipped first, and there would be some proof of authentication that's provided to include in the authorization for the tablet. And then let's say months down the line, the phone becomes available. However, a new proof of authentication is needed for that transaction, then the merchant can perform that merchant-initiated transaction or merchant-initiated authentication that we talked about earlier, and reference or include that ACS transaction ID from that initial authentication when it occurred with the cardholder present. So authentication on the phone can happen months down the line with the ACS transaction ID included. And the hope is that ACSs and on the issuer side, they'll be able to reference and see how they authenticated that initial purchase and provide proof of authentication that the merchant can use. So the split shipment scenario, we do have indicators in the EMV 3DS specification so that merchants can communicate that this is what this request is referencing.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one or two more questions. This question is another merchant-related question. Is the gift card indicator only for a gift card, or is this to be used for other high-risk items?
The specific gift card indicators are specific to gift cards. So if there was a gift card added to the cart, or if it's the only item in the cart. If we're looking to provide information either on items or other risk of the order, we may want to look at a different field to communicate that versus leveraging the gift card field. But that's pretty specific to gift cards only.
Okay, terrific. Well, this is all the time that we have for today. So I want to thank you all for participating in today's webinar. Special thanks go to our presenters, Christy Cook with Target, Michael Express, and Ian Poole with Cardinal Commerce for today's webinar. Again, here's our contact information. If anybody would like to follow up with questions for any of today's participants that didn't get answered, you can submit them to us and we'll try to get them responses back to you. And feel free to contact us about future activities with the U.S. Payments Forum. Today's webinar has been recorded and will be available for playback along with the presentation deck after the webinar is concluded. And you'll receive an email with a link to where you can listen to the recording as well as download the presentation deck. Please feel free to share this information within your organization to others who could not participate in today's webinar. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you all and have a great day.